Hello. In my series on building better worlds, today I'll be talking about Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 is about the extractive aspects of capitalism, its destructive nature and consequences, and possibilities of resistance. So here we go. So before even I go into the chapter, it is important to just bear in mind the very nature of capitalism as a system itself. It is a deeply extractive and exploitative system. Extractive in what way? From the very beginning of rise of capitalism, you can see that there is an attempt at extracting as many raw materials as possible, then converting them into marketable commodities. So in the first stage, there is involved an activity that literally goes and extracts resources from the land. Then it must exploit labor to transform those resources as cheaply as possible into marketable commodities. That is why if you read Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, they describe in it the emergence of this new kind of subject, the bourgeois, right? And the reason this subject is special is because it is involved in the process of manufacture and production at every end. So it is involved in extraction, it is involved in getting people to transform that into commodities, and then it is involved in consumption and marketing of those commodities. A subject like that never really existed before capitalism. So when the authors here draw our attention to the extraction and extractive nature of capitalism, they are not just introducing us to something new, they are introducing us to something which is ingrained within the logic of capital itself. Because at any given stage of capitalism, the idea is to get something that can be transformed through labor, extract it, transform it, and then market it. So extraction is where the indigenous communities and marginalized communities are being targeted and face the brunt of that aspect of capitalism. So let's look into the chapter a little more and, share our understanding of it. So here is how the authors define extractivism. Extractivism is a capitalistic method of acquiring wealth through the withdrawal of resources or raw materials from either conquered, dispossessed lands, or territories that were encroached on, privatized, and earmarked for commodification. So encased in this definition are two aspects of capitalism. Conquering of territory for extraction, that you could already see in the early phases of rise of capitalism, what we call the mercantile capitalism. So when the Spaniards and Portuguese come to the so-called New World, what are they looking for? Gold. How do they convince the kings and queens of Europe to fund their expeditions? We will bring gold. So during the mercantile capital phase, the Europeans who come to Americas, their purpose is to extract wealth and gold and transport it back. In the process, of course, they destroy native populations, conquer them, massacre them in great numbers. Now, when we look at that history, we think of, we don't do that anymore. Like that doesn't happen anymore. If you have read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, you'll understand, what he does there. He gives us a harrowing account of a quartering But then he tells us when we read this account, we tell ourselves we don't do this anymore. But actually what we do now is more pernicious and destructive to the body and spirit. So the second part of the definition about commodification and about dispossessing people is how capitalism works now. And that is what our authors are focused on, because most of the times, of course, these raw materials exist in lands that have not yet been either possessed, conquered, or excavated by the corporations or even state institutions. Who lives on those lands, like native people in their communities? They tend to be either peasant farmers, right? Or they tend to be communities of people who live in coherent communities with their own social and cultural aspects of life. So if capitalism is extractive and it must constantly seek resources, that's why we see them in the Amazon. That's why we see them in the deserts of Africa. That's why we see them in Pakistan right now. In the process, what the authors are pointing out to us is the rights of the indigenous people are not considered. And if they resist, they are labeled as those who are resisting progress, right? Who are resisting development. But the aim is to extract resources. Now, in the previous phases of capitalism, of course, land itself was a resource. So part of it was capturing the land from the native people, taking it away from them. You can see that in North America, in United States, the entire West, or wherever the native tribes lived, that land itself was a resource and it was extracted forcefully. Now the fight isn't just about the land, though it is about that as well, but also the resources that the land carries. So all of this combined then shapes the contemporary extractive drive of capitalism. Now, how do they do it? Authors explain it in the chapter, obviously through direct means where they get involved, the state power, the military, and the government declares a territory as something from where resources can be extracted, and people are sidelined, sometimes relocated, and often murdered and brutalized. Indirectly, it can be done through the private sector, where the government can give land rights to someone who is rich, the landholders. They then hire private militias to clear the land, right, or to keep the natives under control. All of these forces are at work to control territories and acquire territories where people are already living. It also involves destroying that way of life, right? Because if you are a tribe living in the Amazon or in the mountains of Pakistan, there is an ecological balance that you maintain to sustain your life. But if a corporation moves in, protected by the army, protected by civilian guards, they are not interested in retaining the ecological balance of that territory. They are interested in whatever they want to extract. So in the process, they will destroy the local ecology, but also destroy the local way of life. Sometimes land itself is a resource, and I am going out of the book for this example. For example, in Pakistan, the biggest business in Pakistan right now is land development. There is one big company who owns the government, who owns even the military officials, retired ones, and they are the ones who develop these massive urban developments, luxury living, right? Most of the times, they just go and take land from the rural peasants. And when the rural peasants rise against them, the police, the power of the state is there to keep them in check. Right now, in the south of Pakistan, there is a beach called Gawadar. A city is being built there by Chinese funding. It's going to be the largest deep sea port. Fine, maybe that's good for Pakistan. But in the process, the local population who relied on fishing, who had an intact culture, they are completely kept out of this new development. And they are not even seeing any benefits, but their way of life has been destroyed. So that is when land is acquired for use. In my hometown in Pakistan, this big real estate company that I talked about took over all the lands that were around a small river. Those were government lands, but people subsisted on them, right? But our former dictator gave that land to this private company. And then they encroached on the neighboring villages. Now, there are two ways of coercion. One, of course, is you forcefully remove the people, or other, you offer them a lot of money. And if people start taking the money and selling you the land, they might have some short-term gain, but eventually their whole culture will be destroyed. So if you go to one of these developments, you'll see a strange sight. You'll see these developed neighborhoods, but right in the middle of it is an intact village, which is surrounded by this private property. That's the only village that came together as a community and went to the Supreme Court and said, we do not want to sell our lands. So they are still there. Their lives are harder because, they are surrounded by this developed world. But it's an amazing phenomenon because it's a story of resistance physically, but also through the legal system. So my point here was that it's not just the resources in the land that are extracted. The land itself is what is taken over by the corporations and by the state, all in the name of development. And as a result, what happens is a way of life is destroyed. A way of life that probably was closer to the ecologically conscious customs and tradition. Now, the authors also discuss with us, just as the Zapatistas have resisted this aspect of capitalism, this extractive part of it, and have faced the state brutality and brutality of the private militias, there are so many other things that are used against the indigenous people. First is the naked power and force, which involves either contracting private militias or even the state troops to oust people or to isolate them in the name of progress. It has happened in Mexico. It has happened at different places on the African continent. In my own home country, Pakistan, it is happening right now. So the communities have to face the brunt of the brutal onslaught in the name of progress and development. Then there is also legal dispossession. The state would sometimes declare a territory as something strategic to their interest and hence either oust people from there or deny them access to the natural resources of that land. If you want to see a clear-cut example of it that no one in the West pays attention to, it is the occupation of West Bank and Gaza by the State of Israel, especially in the West Bank right now. So people are there. They have lived there all this time. The territory was captured by the State of Israel. And right now, the State of Israel keeps pushing settlers into that territory, these settlers come in with this idea that God has given them land, hence the native people who live there, who are mostly peasant farmers, right, who have their olive groves and a way of life. With the help of the Israeli armed forces, the settlers are slowly pushing the Palestinians out of their own lands, taking it over for the land itself, for its resources. That's almost, a sadly classic example of how it is accomplished against the indigenous populations through stratagem, but also through brute force. Other things that happen to the activists, the water defenders, the environmental defenders, is also sometimes the state media and even private enterprises, stigmatize them, make them into a target, label them as miscreants, as terrorists. If you're part of a women resistance group, the burden is even heavier. Your reputation can be tarnished, you can be targeted, and of course the fear of murder and death is always there. These are some of the things that the extractive drive of capitalism unleashes and is unleashing right now in order to constantly either grab land, hold on to it, or extract its resources for the ultimate profit earning motive that runs capitalism. Now, a question that you might ask yourself is, why are the authors focusing so much on this extractive drive of capitalism and how it unleashes itself on the indigenous communities? I think, and it's mentioned in the chapter too, it is to make us realize that the fight against this isn't just a cosmetic fight for a few rights here and there. Since this destructive and extractive aspect is part of the genome of capitalism itself, the fight then is against capitalism. To figure out a way of life, another world is possible, in which we can have a different system, a more balanced system, a more life-giving system, right? That is what I think this chapter clearly highlights. So towards the end of the chapter, then, when we go to the Zapatistas, we know that they're the one who have faced the onslaught of the Mexican state, of the private owners and landlords and their militias. Corporations were interested in their territory to extract raw materials, including medicinal herbs and everything else, upon which the native people have a right? And Zapatistas have withstood at a great cost to their communities, and not just withstood that onslaught, but retained their autonomy and constantly built their communities. But in the process of doing so, they do not give us a recipe. They do not say, here, do this and you'll be successful. No, they acknowledge, as you read the excerpt from Subcomandante Galeano's writing, is the two girls talking to each other, right? One of them says, we're going to die, but we'll make sure it counts. That is radical hope. When you're up against forces of capitalism supported by state and private stakeholders, when you're outnumbered, outgunned, you probably know that maybe they will defeat you in this battle and that battle. But what matters is that you make it count so that a larger solidarity develops, each fighting their own battles in their own way, but towards an end in which the destruction of extractive capital is stopped. And maybe, and that's the radical hope part of it, which we learn from the Zapatistas, but other movements too, and maybe then another world is possible. another world in which we live with the land. We respect our differences and we share the resources of the planet. So overall, then, this chapter is teaching us quite a few important things. It's highlighting for us the destructive nature of extractive capitalism, that indigenous and marginalized and rural communities are usually the biggest targets of it, and they suffer the most. And they are the ones who are leading the fights wherever they are in the world. That the fight isn't just to stop exploitation, but it is to rewrite the system of capitalism in a way that it is transformed into a more life-giving, life-sustaining system. And that when we go to Zapatistas to learn from their actions, because they have faced all these things, right? Land grabbing, destruction of their livelihoods, extraction from their lands. We learn that just as they said enough is enough and fought back on different fronts, but in the process also built their communities, built their political systems, everyone else, particular to their own region and their own fights, can also develop a mode of resistance with the hope, with the radical hope that things will change and we will be able to create better worlds, right? Worlds in which more worlds fit in, where difference is possible and is respected, life is protected, and the planet itself is protected, collectively, wherever we are, against the acquisitive, extractive, and destructive drive of capitalism. So that's all I have to share about this chapter. I hope this is useful to you. If you have any questions, concerns, please post them in the comments and maybe I'll, rethink it and address those. But thank you so much for your journey with me. I will now see you with the next chapter pretty soon. Until then, stay safe, take care, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.